be cutting and pasting on cards. And I am a black gay man, so guess what? This was done at about 4 o'clock. So, okay. Just keeping it 100. And I'm glad that you guys are laughing, because here's the thing. Yes, this is serious stuff. Yes, this is real stuff and hard stuff. But for me, and I'm choking up and I'm not supposed to be choking up, this is real. And this is a dream come true, to look into this audience and see myself in all of you. And for you all to come and be here so that we can have fellowship. Because what I know from our ancestors is that when things get rough, we show up together, and there's a spirit that will be created in this space. And this will be a sacred space for us. So I thank you all for coming. And being here and supporting Native Son. This is amazing to me. The idea, I'll be very real with you guys, and I've told this at the Native Son Awards in November. I was laid off from my job. I wanted to be laid off from my job because I knew that there was other work that I needed to be done in the world. I went to India on an Eat, Pray, Love tour, and as I was dreaming about what my life would become, it was very clear to me that there was something that had to do with authenticity and moving culture, which is my dream, moving to New York from Hampton University, from Cincinnati before that. And then there was, what did I want to do for my people, for black gay men? And I feel an obligation. I feel that it's important to give back. And so I didn't know what the name would be. And one day I looked up on my bookshelf and I saw Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin, and I picked it up and started rereading it, and I was like, Native Son, come on. Like, one thing I know is headlines and brands, so Native Son. And so that's where Native Son, the idea, was born. Most of you in the room know I've mentored a lot of you, I've worked with a lot of you, I've admired a lot of you, and kikied and hung out with a lot of you. So it's very, you know that I'm very passionate about being a black gay man and being authentic to that. So tonight's conversation, Stay Woke, Black Gay Men, Our Voice, Our Power in the Age of Trump, came about because on the day of inauguration, I started getting all these texts and emails and calls from people saying, okay, so what are we doing? What are you doing? And I was like, okay. And one person literally said, which I've not shared with you, they were like, have you talked to Darnell? And I was like, not recently. I was like, but I need to. And what I realized was that we need to have this space. We need to have this conversation because we need to create and set an agenda for black gay men that moves us forward, that protects us, that covers us, that sustains us as a community, and that brings us together, especially with all the craziness that is going on in the White House. I want to formally introduce our panelists, which is going to be a little long because we did the short intros, but I think that part of, for me, what Native Son is really about is that we see each other and that we celebrate each other, and I want everyone to know how dynamic we are. So I want to read these brothers' bios because it's super important. So Darnell L. Moore, in the all-white, looking very snazzy, is the senior correspondent of Mike News, co-managing editor at the Feminist Wire, and writer-in-residence at the Center on African American Religion, Politics, Social Justice at Columbia University. He's assisted in organizing the Black Lives Matter ride to Ferguson in the wake of Mike Brown's tragic murder, along with the founders, and developed the infrastructure for Black Lives Matter Network. His writing has been seen in MSNBC, The Guardian, Huffington Post, Ebony, The Root, The Advocate, and Out Magazine. He's in the process, and he joined us in the middle of this process, so I'm very grateful, of completing his first book, No Fire in the Ashes, which is going to be the publisher's The Nation's book. So Darnell L. Moore, who you all know. Jarrett Lucas has, this gentleman to my right, has spent 15 years supporting movements that serve women, LGBTQ people, and communities of color. He currently heads Stonewall Community Foundation as the executive director. So you should know that he's young, and he's a black gay man running Stonewall. That's major in our space. So he currently it's Stonewall Community Foundation is a prolific grant maker with an annual budget of $1.2 million. So you see what he's overseeing. Lucas also advises on the Rubin Foundation and Paris-based strategy agency, the Lafayette Practice. Previously, Lucas led a consulting firm focused on American human rights advocacy with clients including GLAAD, PFAW, and the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. In addition to 33 arrests for civil disobedience, Lucas' activism has garnered 3 congressional tributes and been featured in 2 award documentaries and been covered in Newsweek, Mother Jones, and the New York Times. To my far left, right? Yes. Yes, far left. Kamal is a Palestinian Black American activist, artist, and interior designer raised in both the United States and Middle East. Kamal's activism explores the intersectionality and parallel struggles of both Palestinian and Black liberation efforts to advance successful mechanisms in taking down systems of racism, oppression, and discrimination. Kamal is a member of Tarab NYC, a safe space community for LGBTQI Middle Eastern and or North African people, and of Al-Qaz, an organization for sexual and gender diversity in Palestinian society. He is also in cooperation with Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, BDS, movement working to end international support for Israel's oppression of Palestinians and pursuing Israel to comply with international law. He holds a bachelor's in fine arts from the Kansas City Art Institute and a master's in interior design from RISD. So Richard Scott Brookshire III, and I made him use his full name. He was like, why can't I just be Richard Brookshire? I was like, no, because we're gonna do the full name. He's a queer Haitian American writer and political commentary Tator, whose work focuses on race, queer identity, and politics, a former combat medic and Army veteran. Richard is, okay, that's Richard is a graduate of Fordham University and holds an MPA in Urban Politics and Governance from Columbia University. Currently, he manages external engagement for Council of Urban Professionals, an organization dedicated to racial and gender parity in the highest levels of leadership in corporate America. He is the Huffington Post Black Voices contributor and co-host of Reparations Podcast, which is a bi-weekly conversation deconstructing racial pathology in American pop culture. Richard Brookshire. Robert Suttle, to my far right, is Assistant Director of the Zero Project, a network of people living with HIV and allies fighting for freedom from stigma and injustice. He was convicted under Louisiana's HIV-specific criminal statute after accepting a plea bargain and served 6 months in Louisiana prison for HIV non-disclosure to a former partner with whom he had a contentious relationship. Upon his release in January 2001, Robert has become engaged in anti-criminalization advocacy work. Robert is featured in the short film HIV is Not a Crime and has traveled abroad sharing his story. Currently serves as a board co-chair of the North American regional affiliate of the Global Network of People Living with HIV/AIDS and remains active with the Positive Justice Project and HIV Justice Network. He's been living with HIV for 14 years. So now we start the discussion. Thank you for bearing with me, but I think it's really important that we understand who we are in the room with and who's talking, and that we celebrate and see these brothers because they're incredible and dynamic and smart. So I want to start off by saying not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced, and that is by James Baldwin. We're living in unprecedented times under President Trump. Everything is now going through challenges being cut off, education, healthcare, immigration, religious freedom, labor practices, the arts, culture, equal rights, civil rights, and social justice. We're under fire right now. This is also a time where Black gay men have more visibility thanks to the success of the film Moonlight and I Am Not Your Negro. We also live in triple consciousness. We are Black, we are gay, and we are men. So, Darnell, I would like you to start it off. From your perspective, what are the concerns of Black gay men in America under President Trump's leadership, and what does this mean from a social justice perspective?
Sure. So first, Emil, thank you for gathering us together. This is a feat for all of us to be in this space on today's Wednesday, on a Wednesday evening, in the middle of the week, and to see everybody in this space in that way. So a few things. I think one of the things we've been hindered by is an ability to find the exact language to describe the moment that we're in. So I think it's important for us to use exact language and not the language fed to us through media and propaganda. So you heard words like sort of this new notion of the alt-right. That's fancy parlance for white nationalism. Right now, this is Trump's ascension is part of a rise of global fascism around the world. I know you all know that far before white nationalism seeped into the American political system, this was happening in other places around the world, right? In the UK, we see places like Australia. So in certain ways, this is part of a global regime, but it's also a repudiation against our first Black president, a repudiation against a sort of awakening of a social justice movement organized around the most marginalized people in our country, namely Black and brown people, and so much else. But I do want to temper this a bit to say that Black Lives Matter as a mantra and as a movement came under the weight and the rise of a Black president. Well, let me reiterate what that means. If under a Black president we were being killed and police got off with impunity, if George Zimmerman walked free when a Black president and a Black AG was in office, if Sandra Bland, Rakia Boyd, Renisha McBride, I can go on and on with all the names that you all know, you have marched and sort of with those names lifted up, they died while a Black person was in office. And mostly a Black administration was in office. And this is not to slam Obama, but you do realize that people didn't start being deported when Trump got here. There had been folk who have been fighting an immigration fight for years. A large amount of people have been deported under the Obama administration, actually, and violently detained. That is to say that if all of those things were already on the rise, and if we already felt like our lives were on the line under a Black president that we loved because he appeared to be more progressive than what we have now, what more should we be worrying right now? And I do want to say that because in some ways we hold up Trump as the big ugly monster in the room when in fact some of these policies went on under our noses, under the guise of a type of liberalism that we supported. Does this make sense? Yes? No? I'm calling myself, because like we were like, oh my God, look, Trump's about to deport. I'm like, no, they've been deporting people all along. Now, because it didn't touch our house, it didn't touch many of us in this room in a way that we think is going to touch us now, we may not have cared about it. But I always say, whose marches did we show up to prior to Trump's ascendancy? Not just our pride marches, not just the shit that matters to Black gay men, but were we showing up for the when women's issues were on a rise and women's reproductive rights were being rolled back prior to Trump getting here? So this to me is a moment that I think is crystallizing the need for a coalitional, intersectional politic. That is, you can't just worry about the shit that touches you in your house. Women's rights, women's reproductive rights have always been an issue. Trans women have been dying far before Trump got into office. And a lot of us were silent about that. Many of our Latino brothers and sisters have been scared of deportation far before Trump got into the office. Now it's been escalated. Militarism has been on the rise. The budgets have been on the rise. Drone attacks have occurred in places where other black and brown people live. When a black man was in the office, while we were voting him in. And so many of us didn't worry. So I want to, the reason why I'm reframing the question, because all of that happened in a moment of what we might understand to be safe liberalism. And here we are now under a global fascist project that we're not prepared for. So it means everything that we would have gone through before is now escalated. And it's requiring of us not to have what I call a single variable political response to this. That is, to only care about the things that touch us. And by intersectional, that means how can we together as black gay men, black queer men, black bi men, however we're identifying, also think about what life means. Michael Johnson's case, you heard of this Tiger Mandingo case? If we haven't, we should have, right? HIV recriminalization, that happened under Obama's presidency. A brother went to jail for some of the same things that you talk about in your bio, right? All of these things have been going on. This is now asking of us, if the powers are amping up against us, it's for us to amp up our resistances to all of those things that are happening, and to do that in coalition together and in an intersectional way.
Amen. So, Jarrett, you talked about we have to locate ourselves in the movement. So talk about that, especially kind of following what Darnell said.
It's actually the perfect segue.
Yeah.
And I didn't know you were going to go there, but of course I should have known. So, staying woke, right, is very much about our ability to perceive, examine, and understand the world around us, including our position in the world, especially on a socio-political level. And when you start talking about intersectionality, you're saying that you have to understand the multiplicity of identities that you hold and how that shows up in the world around you, right? And so, picking up on this thread of people being under attack under this administration, one of the things I'm clear on, and I think we need to be clear on, is that if we stand on the sidelines or have stood on the sidelines waiting for us to become the obvious target, we've already lost ground. And so, for example, this travel ban, it's been framed as an anti-Muslim ban, right? And when people hear the word Muslim, they often think of brown folks, particularly people who are Arab or South Asian. And I feel like we have to, in locating ourselves in this movement, both in the oppression and in the resistance, understand where it is that we sit in that. And so, from my perspective, and keeping in line with the thought that staying woke means understanding the world around you and understanding yourself, I think we have to see that 3 of the 7 countries that this ban affected were on the African continent. If you look across all of the practitioners of mainstream traditional religions in Africa, about 50% practice Islam. When you think about the individual experience of someone coming to the US seeking asylum from a home country where they've been persecuted for any number of reasons, you see some really unique circumstances. You see people almost always traveling alone, which is unlike the circumstances of many refugees. You see people traveling alone without any type of support system. You land in the US, you're detained, maybe put in Elizabeth Detention Center. You're subject to sexual and physical harassment and violence because you look and behave a bit differently, and people read that as a point of weakness, right? And then you have no systems by which to hold those institutions accountable. And so the people that are suffering are already us, and we've been misled to believe that it's someone else. And so we show up to the Solidarity March when it's really our march. At Stonewall, I know this to be true in a very practical way. We have what is the largest scholarship in the country for immigrants to the United States who are LGBTQI. And 40% of the awardees, we've been doing this for going on 4 years, 40% of the awardees of this scholarship are gay men from the African continent. And it's real in my work, but I think it needs to be real in our consciousness, because we may then be more likely to show up for ourselves?
So I was going to go to Richie, but I'm actually going to jump to Kamal because I think this is a great place of intersection. But you talked about understanding the intersectionality of liberalism efforts.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it really does play off what both the young men said right now. And this idea that, I mean, I know this expression has been used, probably like overused. Any oppression somewhere is oppression everywhere. And it doesn't take very long for it to like creep up on you. And being woke and being aware of the way the systems actually work and who are in places in the systems and how that actually gets carried out, I think is a big part of reclaiming our identities and not just allowing other people to kind of section us off and cut us off from who we are. Looking at the diverse makeup that makes our Black community, our gay community, we can start to see that we have, we can't help but see diversity. And in diversity, there's growth. And at some point, we're gonna have to embrace that. Like really embrace the fact that these issues that are affecting us need to be challenged in a way where we can fully view ourselves and see ourselves. And I think that we need to open ourselves up to the idea that we are, multi-identities and we are multi-backgrounds. So as long just the practice in looking at yourself while looking at others, seeing others and seeing yourself.
Yeah, it's interesting because, when people press me about Native Son and like, why did you focus on Black gay men? I was like, well, I'm a Black gay man. So I'm starting at home and what I know. But I tell people, which goes back to what you were talking about, Darnell, is that I was really most moved by the trans movement. Because I was like looking at what the trans community is doing and speaking up and being present and really mobilizing. And to your point, they are the ones that are killed at record numbers. And we all stand around and look and like, oh, what, huh? And, I thought about it, and it's interesting. I was talking to Janet Mock last week, and I was telling her about this particular panel, and she was like, I'm so glad you're doing this. I said, but you inspired me because you own your truth, and you stand in that truth, and this is what we have to do. So I love what you both, all three, just said, because if we don't know, and this is not new, it's just more in our face right now. So, Richie, you wanted to talk about, I was very curious about your points on queerness and immigration.
So I think, I guess I'll first start to start saying that America has created very specific kinds of conditions. American evangelicalism, Christian evangelicalism in Africa, and in Black countries in general. There's been like this embrace of obviously like Christian ideals. And because of that, I think it creates unsafe conditions for a lot of Black gay men in these countries. And so oftentimes they're the ones that are trying to come to places like the United States. And so when we think about immigration, I think it's often positioned as a conversation in and around people coming from South America, from Europe. But Black gay immigrants make up a large portion of the people that are migrating to the United States. And oftentimes they are trying to escape political oppression, economic oppression, that's specifically the work of the United States in doing. And this country doesn't do a good job of creating space for them. Out of all of the classifications of immigrants, Black people, 90% of the time are here legally. But I think as we think about how Trump is trying to curtail immigration in general, starting with the Muslim ban, we have to anticipate, and I think one of the big things that we're going to have to do going forward is anticipate these kinds of moves, is he's going to start rolling out policies that specifically target, at first it will seem as though they're not specifically targeting Black people, but they'll have very Black implications. And so I think we have to anticipate that. And then also I think when I think about Blackness, I don't think of it as a monolith. So I'm the product of immigration. My mother was a Haitian immigrant. And so I hold steadfast to that identity, but I also know that just as trans people are dying here and all over the world, black gay men are dying all over the world. And their governments are persecuting them. And oftentimes it's those governments that are aligned with Christianity, and then therefore America supports their leaders, and economically and otherwise. And so we have to hold our government to account, but then also create space for these men and make this movement a global movement, because they need us a lot. And a lot of times I think Americans, myself included, don't necessarily think of ourselves in an international kind of perspective. And we don't recognize the privileges that we have as Americans. And so although it's incredibly difficult here at times to be black and gay, it is incredibly difficult to be black and gay, or to be gay in general in places like Haiti, in places like South Africa or Nigeria, in places that persecute people just for who they are.
So connecting to that, Robert, I think this is a great transition for you. I would like you to, kind of expand upon kind of the HIV criminalization, but criminalization of black people in general.
I would say that in connection with, since we're also talking about immigration, that for HIV, a lot of people leave those countries that oppress them for whatever reasons, and they come to the US and they're also living with HIV. And so they're unaware of HIV criminalization laws. And so that's another, I guess, slippery slope, if you want to call it, for people who are immigrants that come from other countries that happen to be living with HIV and transferring to other countries. For a long time, I appreciate what Darnell said about how these things have been happening, so it's not like this stuff that's happening now is just all of a sudden happening now. The issue around HIV criminalization has been happening since the late 80s, the early 90s, where black people were already disproportionately impacted by mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and also the issue around HIV, which many people were only, how can I say this? Their minds were only on the fact that people were dying of HIV, and I totally get that. I mean, I was born in 1979, so I was a baby in the 80s, and so when the height of the epidemic was happening. And so HIV, AIDS definitely impacts our community. Even still today, 30 plus years, it still impacts our community. But what people were not aware of was these HIV criminalization laws that exist. And what I mean by HIV criminalization, meaning it's the inappropriate use of the criminal law against a person simply because of their HIV status for exposure, perceived exposure, or transmission, or the fact that it's not disclosing HIV to a person prior to engaging in a sexual act with them. And so the reason why I know about this so much is because I'm someone who's actually been prosecuted, and I was not aware of HIV criminalization laws when I was diagnosed. I was told that I could go on and live a healthy life, and that is what I believed. And I had plans after college, because I found out 2 months prior to graduating from college, and I wanted to go on with my life and live, and that's what I did. But little did I know that 5 years, ahead, that I would, 5 years later, that I would face something that I never expected, as far as being prosecuted for anything, and also being exposed because of my HIV status and considered to be a dangerous person, to the point where now I'm a convicted felon and a registered sex offender here in this country. And so that really woke my eyes up. I mean, I felt I was woke, but this really woke me up and caused me to pay attention not only just to HIV criminalization, but also a lot of issues that impact our community, because we shouldn't have to wait till something happens to us for us to start paying attention to these things. And so I share this news to encourage you and not to bring fear to you, because this is something that with this information we can empower ourselves and be able to navigate through our relationships, especially if you're a person living with HIV, or just understanding how these laws are applied to people. And so the problems are, we have excessive sentencing, long sentences, 30 plus years in some states, some jurisdictions, convicted felon, registered sex offender, and as a person of color or a black person, we already know that it's hard living black in this country. So can you imagine living with those labels? Or for me, being black, HIV positive, gay, convicted felon, registered sex offender, and living in the South. You know, so this is a very serious issue, as all of these issues are, and we need to be woke. We need to stay woke because this is not going away, and this is why I like these spaces to interject something for idea that people may not even thought of, because they're like, "What? This is happening?" It's like, yeah, it is. And with the way that HIV and AIDS impacts our community, we need to be aware of this, not only on prevention, but also the barriers that criminalization and the undue hardship that it puts on our lives.